Welcome to Central Global News. Today we will look at Central and Eastern European countries where the COVID pandemic is at its peak. Several countries are experiencing record numbers for infections and deaths, and most of these countries still struggle with a low vaccine rollout and widespread vaccine skepticism. In Poland, the media has been reporting about the health sector reaching a breaking point, as the number of new infections is at its highest since the start of the pandemic last year. In some hospitals, almost all of the beds are occupied by COVID patients. There is also a shortage of doctors in the country, so the government is now trying to attract doctors from abroad. To slow down the infection rate, tougher pandemic restrictions have been introduced for a 2-week period surrounding Easter. Schools, shops, and businesses are closed, but for Easter, churches remain open with the number of worshippers limited. Poland's vaccine rollout is speeding up, but for now the hospitals remain under extreme pressure. A relatively high percentage of the country's population believes the pandemic is a hoax, which might make it more difficult to speed up the vaccination process and slow down the rate of infections. Right now, Hungary has one of the worst COVID mortality rates in the world, as every day hundreds of people die from coronavirus. This country is also suffering from a shortage of doctors, which is at 25%, and the shortage of nurses is at 30%. This is mostly due to emigration of health professionals, but another 5,500 doctors quit last month because of the government's controversial wage reform that introduced new regulations for their employment. Doctors and nurses are not allowed to speak about the difficult conditions in hospitals publicly, and the press is not allowed into hospitals either, which might result in the population not taking COVID restrictions seriously enough. Recently, 28 editorial offices of Hungarian publications and websites requested in an open letter to the legislators to allow the media into COVID wards and make it possible for health workers to talk to the press about the conditions in hospitals. On the other hand, Hungary's vaccination rate is one of the highest in Europe. More than 1 in 5 Hungarians has received the first dose already. This is partly due to Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's controversial decision to buy Russia's Sputnik V and China's Sinopharm vaccines. However, many Hungarians are skeptical about these vaccines. In Ukraine, some 400 people are now dying every day because of coronavirus. Different regions have different restrictions in the country, but in most of the West and in the capital Kiev, there are strict pandemic measures in place. Only essential shops are open, schools are closed, and access to public transport is limited as well. The country's vaccination rate is one of the lowest in Europe. Both the procurement and the delivery of the vaccines has been slow. More than a month after the first vaccines arrived in Ukraine, just less than 250,000 people have received a single dose, and only 2 people have had both doses. There are not only logistical issues with the vaccination rollout. Widespread vaccine skepticism is also a problem, with about 50% of Ukrainians not willing to be vaccinated even if they had the chance. Slovakia in recent weeks has had some of the worst COVID statistics in Europe, but now its vaccination rate of 15% is higher than the EU average. The Prime Minister Igor Matovic recently stepped down after a crisis within the government due to his controversial decision to buy the Russian Sputnik V vaccine and his overall handling of the pandemic. Matovic decided to acquire 2 million doses of the Russian vaccine in a secret deal, despite disagreement from his coalition allies. As the political crisis escalated, several ministers resigned, and the scandal eventually caused the Prime Minister to resign as well. Now the government is being rebuilt, with Finance Minister Eduard Heger taking over as Prime Minister. Most ministers who resigned during the crisis are now returning to the cabinet. In the Czech Republic, the number of new COVID cases is slowly decreasing, and the country is preparing for less strict COVID measurements. Schools are expected to reopen in a week if the numbers will not rise again. The government asked people not to mingle during Easter, so the opening plan can be put into effect. Recently, an NGO has painted 25,000 crosses on Prague's Old Town Square to represent those who died because of coronavirus. As there are no tourists at the moment, the square is now functioning as a memorial instead of an attraction. That's it for today's podcast. Thank you for listening.